Our new life in a perfect town was shattered when a nosy neighbor called the police on my wife. Little did she know, she'd just picked a fight with the chief of police. Moving was supposed to be a new beginning, a reward. My wife, Sarah, had just received the promotion of a lifetime. It was the kind of career leap that changes everything: your zip code, your income, your entire future. The job required us to relocate to Maple Creek, a town that looked like it was pulled straight from a postcard. Manicured lawns, pristine white fences, and an almost eerie sense of quiet. It was the perfect place to decompress from her high-stress, incredibly demanding line of work. We found a beautiful two-story colonial at the end of a cul-de-sac, our forever home, and spent the first week unpacking boxes and dreaming about the peaceful life we were about to build. That peace lasted exactly 8 days. That's when we met Brenda. Brenda lived 2 houses down, in a home with a lawn so perfect it looked like astroturf and rose bushes that were trimmed with surgical precision. We hadn't even formally met her, but we knew of her. We saw her peeking through her blinds whenever a car she didn't recognize drove down the street. We saw her marching out to measure the distance of a neighbor's trash can from the curb with a tape measure. She was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, and we, the new arrivals, were her latest subjects to be scrutinized. Our first real interaction was less of an introduction and more of an indictment. She left a welcome basket on our porch. Tucked inside, amongst some bland store-bought muffins, was a laminated, double-sided sheet of paper titled Neighborhood Covenants and Courtesies. It detailed everything from the approved shades of holiday decorations to the designated hours for lawn mowing. Saturdays, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. only. Sarah read it, let out a long, weary sigh, and tossed it onto the growing pile of junk mail on the counter. "Well," she said, "at least we know who's in charge." The real fireworks started on a Saturday morning, about a month after we'd moved in. I was in the kitchen making coffee, looking out the window at Sarah. She was finally having a moment to herself, dressed in old sweatpants and one of my faded band t-shirts, hair tied up in a messy bun. She was tending to the sad, neglected rose bushes the previous owners had left behind. She had her earbuds in, probably listening to a true crime podcast, her weird way of relaxing from her job. It was the most relaxed I'd seen her in weeks. She looked like any other person enjoying a quiet weekend. Then the predator emerged. Brenda, dressed in a crisp pink tracksuit, marched across her lawn and onto ours like she was leading a charge. I couldn't hear anything, but I had a front-row seat to the pantomime. Brenda started talking, her hands gesturing emphatically, pointing at our slightly too long grass and then at her watch. Sarah, clearly startled, pulled one earbud out. I saw her offer a polite but tired smile. She said something brief, probably an apology or an explanation that we were still settling in. Brenda was not having it. Her face, already pinched with disapproval, tightened into a mask of pure indignation. She took a step closer, her voice clearly rising even though I couldn't make out the words. Sarah's posture changed. The relaxed homeowner disappeared, and a flicker of the woman I saw when she was in work mode appeared. Her back straightened. She said something else, her tone firm and final, then popped her earbud back in and deliberately turned her back on Brenda, focusing once more on a stubborn weed. It was a dismissal. A calm, quiet, but absolute dismissal. And for someone like Brenda, it was the ultimate insult. I watched, half amused and half dreading the fallout, as Brenda stood there sputtering, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Her face went from pink to a blotchy, furious red. She spun on her heel and stomped back to her house, slamming her front door so hard I could hear it from my kitchen. I chuckled to myself, shaking my head. "Welcome to the suburbs, Sarah," I whispered, and went back to my coffee. I figured that was the end of it. A bit of neighborhood drama. A funny story to tell our old friends. I was so wrong. About 10 minutes later, a faint sound pricked my ears. A siren. It was distant at first, a familiar city noise that felt out of place in our sleepy town. But it wasn't fading. It was getting louder, closer. A second siren joined the first, the wails growing in intensity until they were deafening. I looked out the front window again, my heart starting to pound. 2 police cruisers, lights blazing, were turning onto our quiet cul-de-sac. They weren't speeding through. They were slowing down. They were stopping. Right in front of our house. My blood went cold. I saw Brenda standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, her arms crossed, a smug, triumphant smirk plastered across her face. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my wife, who was now standing up, dirt on her knees, looking utterly bewildered by the flashing red and blue lights painting our house. 2 officers, both young, probably fresh out of the academy, got out of their cars. They adjusted their belts, their faces set with a grim seriousness that felt absurdly out of place, and they started walking towards the woman in the faded t-shirt who was calmly trimming roses. They were walking towards my wife, and from the look on Brenda's face she clearly believed she was about to watch the glorious public humiliation of the rude new neighbor who dared to ignore her. I nearly dropped my coffee mug. My feet were moving before my brain had fully processed the scene. I pushed open our front door and stepped out onto the porch, the flashing lights washing over me in waves of red and blue. The suburban silence was completely shattered. A few other neighbors were peeking out their windows, drawn by the commotion. This was exactly what Brenda wanted. A spectacle. "What's going on?" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. One of the officers, the taller one with Miller on his name tag, turned to look at me. "Sir, please stay on your porch. We're handling this." "Handling what? My wife pulling weeds?" I watched as Officer Miller approached Sarah. His partner, a younger-looking kid named Thompson, stood a few feet back, his hand hovering near his belt, in that way cops do when they're trying to project authority. "Ma'am," Miller started, his voice a practiced, neutral tone. "We received a call about a disturbance at this address." Sarah had finally taken out her other earbud and let it drop, dangling against her shirt. She brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of a dirt-stained glove, leaving a small smudge of soil on her temple. She looked at the officer. Then her eyes flickered over to Brenda, who was now standing with her arms crossed, nodding emphatically, as if to say, "That's right. Tell her." "A disturbance?" Sarah repeated, her voice perfectly calm. "Officer, I've been gardening for the last hour. The only disturbance I'm aware of is this one." She gestured with her head towards the 2 police cruisers currently turning our quiet street into a disco. Brenda, overhearing this, couldn't contain herself. "She's lying," she shrieked from her lawn. "She was blasting music and acting erratically. When I, as a concerned citizen, went to check on her, she became hostile and belligerent. I feared for my safety." I scoffed loudly from the porch. "Feared for your safety. She's 5'6" and holding a trowel, Brenda, not a broadsword." Officer Thompson shot me a warning look. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again." Sarah held up a hand, a gesture that was both for me and for the officers. It was a subtle signal to de-escalate, one I knew well. She turned her full attention back to Officer Miller. There was no loud music, just my podcast in my earbuds, and I was not belligerent. I simply told your complainant that I was busy and returned to my gardening. She spoke with a clarity and precision that seemed to catch the young officer off guard. There was no defensiveness, no panic, just a statement of facts. But Brenda had poisoned the well, and these officers, young and eager to prove themselves, were taking the call seriously. "Ma'am, regardless, we need to properly identify everyone involved," Miller said, pulling out a small notepad. "The complainant has given us her statement. Now I need yours, and I'll need to see some form of identification." That was it. That was the line. I saw the change in Sarah's posture. It was almost imperceptible, but I'd seen it 1,000 times before. The slight stiffening of her spine, the way her jaw set, the sudden intense focus in her eyes. The tired weekend gardening wife vanished, and in her place was a woman who was used to being in command. She slowly, deliberately pulled off her dirty gardening gloves, dropping them to the grass. She wiped her hands on her sweatpants, her gaze never leaving Officer Miller's face. "You want to see my ID?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation, layered with an icy patience that could freeze fire. "Yes, ma'am," Miller replied, starting to look a little uncomfortable under her unwavering stare. "It's standard procedure." "I'm aware of standard procedure," Sarah said softly. She glanced over his shoulder at the second officer, then back. Her eyes scanned Miller's uniform, his badge, his face. She was sizing him up, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that he was coming up short. Brenda, sensing a victory, called out gleefully, "That's right. Make her show you her ID. She's probably not even supposed to be here." Sarah ignored her completely. She took a single step towards the officers, closing the distance just enough to make them shift their weight uneasily. Her voice dropped even lower, but it cut through the air with absolute authority. "Before we get to my ID, Officer Miller, tell me something. Who's your watch commander on duty today? Sergeant Reynolds, or did Lieutenant Davies get stuck with the weekend rotation again?" Absolute silence. The two officers froze, their professional masks slipping into expressions of pure, unadulterated confusion. Their heads snapped towards each other as if to ask, "Did you hear that?" Brenda's smug grin faltered. How could this woman, this belligerent, erratic stranger in a dirty t-shirt, possibly know the names of their supervising officers? How could she know their shift patterns? In that single moment, the entire dynamic on our front lawn shifted, and I saw the first flicker of genuine fear in the young officer's eyes. They weren't dealing with a suburban housewife anymore. They just had no idea who they were dealing with. Officer Miller's jaw worked for a second before he found his voice. How do you know their names?" he stammered, his procedural confidence completely evaporating. The carefully constructed wall of authority he had built around himself crumbled into dust. Sarah didn't answer his question. Instead, she took another deliberate step forward. "My name," she said, her voice still quiet but now carrying the weight of a judge's gavel, "is Sarah Jennings. I'm afraid I don't have my driver's license on me. I usually don't carry a wallet when I'm pulling dandelions, but my badge and departmental ID are in my purse, just inside the front door." She flickered her eyes towards me for the first time. It was a command. "Honey, would you mind?" I practically vaulted off the porch, my mind racing. This was it, the moment of truth. I flew into the house, grabbed her work bag from the hook by the door, and rummaged inside past her phone and a half-eaten granola bar, until my fingers closed around the familiar cool leather of her badge holder. I walked back out onto the lawn, the air thick with a tension so palpable you could almost see it shimmering. Brenda was watching this exchange with a look of growing horror. Her smug certainty was being replaced by a dawning, sickening realization that she had made a terrible, terrible mistake. The triumphant queen of the cul-de-sac was starting to look like a jester who had just told a fatal joke to the king. I handed the badge holder to Sarah. She didn't open it immediately. She held it in her hand, letting the silence stretch, forcing the two young officers to marinate in their own anxiety. Officer Thompson was now actively avoiding eye contact, his gaze fixed on a particularly interesting patch of clover near his feet. Officer Miller just stared at the leather case in Sarah's hand as if it were a venomous snake. Finally, with a soft flip, Sarah opened it. She held it out, not for them to take, but for them to see. The gold shield inside gleamed in the Saturday morning sun, but it wasn't the shield that made them gasp. It was the text engraved above it. Plain, official, and utterly devastating to their current situation. Chief of Police. I heard a small choked sound. It was Officer Miller. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of pale. Officer Thompson looked like he was about to be physically ill. His hand, which had been hovering so confidently near his sidearm just moments before, was now trembling. "Chief Jennings?" Miller whispered, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry, ma'am. We had no idea. The call came in as a public disturbance, potential suspect hostility." He trailed off, his eyes darting towards Brenda with a look of pure murder. Brenda, for her part, looked as though she had been struck by lightning. Her mouth was wide open, her face a mask of disbelief and terror. The smirk was long gone, replaced by the slack-jawed expression of someone who had just confidently stepped off a cliff. Sarah closed the badge holder with a quiet snap. The sound echoed down the silent street. "The suspect was me, Officer Miller," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "In my own yard. The hostility was me turning my back on a woman who was harassing me on my own property. I trust that the details of this incident will be reflected accurately in your report, including the name of the complainant who wasted departmental resources and your time on a frivolous retaliatory call. Yes, Chief, absolutely, Chief, they both mumbled in unison, their deference almost comical. Good, Sarah said. She then turned her head, very slowly, and pinned Brenda with a gaze so cold it could have caused frostbite. Brenda flinched as if she'd been physically struck. As for you, Sarah began, her voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't just a scolding from a neighbor anymore. This was the new chief of police, a woman Brenda had just publicly accused of being a criminal, addressing her from the middle of a crime scene of her own making. We haven't been formally introduced, Sarah continued, taking a slow, predatory step towards Brenda's property line. I'm your new neighbor, but as of Monday morning at 800 hours, I am also the person who signs the paychecks for every officer in this town, the person who sets departmental policy, the person who reviews every single incident report, especially those involving, let's call them overly enthusiastic, civilian complaints. Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling Brenda's world of petty rules and neighborhood tyranny, piece by piece. She was shrinking, physically wilting under the weight of Sarah's authority. But Sarah wasn't finished. She stopped right at the edge of our lawn, standing on her own turf, a queen surveying a conquered enemy. So let me be perfectly clear, Sarah said, her voice now ablaze. The next time you feel the need to call 911 because my grass is an inch too long, or because you don't like the music I'm listening to in my own ears, you had better be prepared to justify it. Not to Officer Miller or Officer Thompson. You'll justify it directly to me, in my office. Do you understand? Brenda could only manage a series of spastic, terrified nods, her face ashen. Sarah held her gaze for a few more seconds, ensuring her message was received, then turned back to the two petrified officers. You're dismissed, officers, she said, her tone shifting back to professional, but still laced with steel. Go back to your patrols. Yes, Chief, they said, practically tripping over themselves in their haste to retreat. They scrambled back to their cruisers, started the engines, and peeled away from our curb with a speed that was definitely over the neighborhood limit. The flashing lights vanished, and an unnatural quiet descended once more upon the cul-de-sac. It was over. Or so I thought. Sarah stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly fading. Brenda was still frozen on her lawn, a statue of pure regret. I started to walk towards Sarah, a proud grin spreading across my face. She had handled it perfectly. She had established her authority without ever raising her voice. But then, an unfamiliar car, a sleek black sedan I'd never seen before, turned onto our street. It drove slowly, purposefully, and pulled up right behind where the police cruisers had been parked. The tinted window rolled down, and a man in a sharp suit leaned out. He didn't look at me or the shell-shocked Brenda. His eyes were locked directly on my wife. Chief Jennings, he called out, his voice smooth and serious. I'm sorry to interrupt your weekend. We have a situation. My proud grin immediately faded, replaced by a familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. I knew that look, that tone of voice. It was the sound of our quiet weekend officially ending. Sarah's entire demeanor shifted again. The chief of police, who had just expertly dismantled a neighborhood tyrant, was gone, replaced by an on-duty commander facing a new crisis. She turned to face the man in the car, her expression all business. What is it, detective? The man, who I now recognized as Detective Morales, one of her top investigators she'd mentioned meeting last week, gestured down the street. We just got a call. Armed robbery at the Maple Creek Bank downtown. 2 suspects, shots fired. They fled in a blue sedan, last seen heading this way. This way. Towards our quiet, manicured cul-de-sac. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sarah's eyes immediately began scanning the street, the houses, the yards. Her mind was working, processing tactical angles and potential hiding spots. Have units set up a perimeter? She asked, her voice sharp and clear. On it, Chief, Morales replied. But we think they might have ditched the car. This neighborhood is full of hiding places. Garages. Sheds. His eyes briefly flickered towards Brenda's house, with its detached, oversized garage and meticulously landscaped backyard. And in that moment, Brenda, who had been a frozen statue of humiliation, snapped back to life. Her eyes widened, not with fear for herself, but with a terrifying new kind of realization. She spun around and looked at her own house, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. "My garage," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I left it open. The side door. It doesn't always latch." Sarah's head snapped towards her. "What?" "This morning," Brenda stammered, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "I took the bins out before all this. I came back in through the side door. I think I forgot to lock it. Oh God, what if they're in there?" It was a terrifying possibility. A perfect hiding spot. A place no one would think to look. At least not right away. Without a moment's hesitation, Sarah was in motion. "Morales, get your vest on and get units to seal both ends of this street. Now, tell them the chief has eyes on a potential hideout. No sirens. I don't want to spook them if they're in there." "Chief, you're not—" Morales started to protest, but Sarah cut him off with a look that could stop a train. She turned to me. "Stay inside. Lock the doors. Call 911 and tell them exactly what's happening and where we are. Tell them Chief Jennings is on scene." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak, and ran back into the house, my hands shaking as I dialed. I watched through the front window, my heart in my throat, as Sarah took charge. She wasn't my wife in sweatpants anymore. She was a commander on a battlefield. She gestured for Morales, who had retrieved a tactical vest and his service weapon from his trunk, to take a position behind his car. She then looked at Brenda. "Brenda," she said, her voice low but carrying absolute authority. "I need you to tell me everything about your garage. Layout, windows. Is there another way out?" Brenda, pale and shaking, seemed to find a hidden reserve of strength. The neighborhood busybody, the petty tyrant, was gone. In her place was a citizen trying to help. "It's a two-car. My SUV is on the right side, tools on the back wall. There's a small window on the west side, but it's high up. The only other door is the one I left unlocked, the one that leads to the backyard." "The backyard," Sarah repeated, her eyes narrowing. "Does it connect to other yards?" Brenda nodded frantically. "Yes, there's a low hedge. They could get over it easily and be in the Petersons' yard." "Okay," Sarah said, her mind clearly formulating a plan. She unclipped her own phone from her sweatpants. I could hear her voice, crisp and commanding, as she relayed the information to the dispatch I was still on the line with. "This is Chief Jennings. I am on scene. I have the civilian homeowner, potential suspects cornered in a detached garage. Yes, I am armed." I hadn't even noticed. Tucked into the back of her waistband, mostly hidden by her baggy t-shirt, was her off-duty firearm. She saw me looking and gave a quick, reassuring nod, but her focus was entirely on the garage. Within minutes, the street filled silently with police cars, officers emerging with rifles, setting up a cordon. It was a surreal, terrifying ballet. But Sarah was the conductor. She directed them with hand signals, positioning them to cover the backyard and the front of the garage. It was clear who was in charge. These officers, who hadn't met her yet, who only knew a new chief was starting Monday, saw a woman in a dirty t-shirt and sweatpants commanding their respect and obedience without question. Finally, with the perimeter secure, Sarah stood beside Morales behind the sedan. She used his radio to speak. "This is the Maple Creek Police. The building you are in is surrounded. Come out now with your hands empty and visible. You will not be harmed." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Then a crash from inside the garage. A moment later, the high window on the west side shattered as someone tried to climb out. But an officer was already there, rifle trained. Don't move. Hands where I can see them." It was over in seconds. The side door creaked open, and two men, looking panicked and defeated, emerged with their hands in the air. They were quickly swarmed by officers and cuffed. The entire operation, from the moment Morales arrived to the moment the suspects were in custody, had been executed with flawless precision, all orchestrated by a woman in her weekend gardening clothes. As the scene was being secured and the suspects were led away, Sarah finally let out a long breath. She walked back towards our lawn, her shoulders slumping slightly. She looked exhausted. Brenda was standing there, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't looking at the police cars or the cuffed criminals. She was looking at Sarah. I... Brenda started, her voice choked with emotion. You saved... They could have been in my house, with my things. They could have hurt someone. She took a shaky step forward. I am so sorry. I was awful. I was a bully. I had no idea who you were, but that doesn't matter. The way I acted was inexcusable. The apology was raw, genuine, and drenched in shame. Sarah looked at her, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then a small, tired smile touched her lips. Well, Brenda, she said, her voice softening. Let's just say we had a very eventful first official meeting. She extended a hand still smudged with a bit of dirt. Sarah Jennings, I think it's time we started over. Brenda looked at the offered hand, then back at Sarah's face. With a sob of relief, she took it. Brenda Miller, it's an honor, Chief. As I walked out to join them, I knew our life in Maple Creek wasn't going to be the quiet, peaceful existence we had imagined. But watching my incredible wife stand on our lawn, having neutralized a neighborhood nuisance and 2 armed bank robbers in the same hour, I realized it was going to be something much, much better. It was going to be home.